The historic Capitol Theater completed construction and opened its doors in August of 1913 in the beautiful state capital of Salt Lake City in Utah. The theater was designed by Albert G. Landsberg, a graduate from École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, France. The structure had features uncommon for the time, including air conditioning, along with being both fireproof and earthquake-resistant. In 1949, a fire started in the basement of the theater. 600 guests were able to escape the blaze. Tragically, the fire did claim one victim, a 17-year-old usher by the name of Richard George Duffin, who had fallen during his attempted escape. It is said that the spirit of George Duffin is one of several that continue to haunt the Capitol Theater. In today's episode, we will look into the ghosts of Salt Lake City's Capitol Theater. In 1976, the County of Salt Lake took over ownership of the Capitol Theater and restored it to its former glory. The county maintains and operates the buildings and uses its police force to monitor and patrol the building in the evenings. Featured in a Season 2 episode of Paranormal Witness, Officer Dave Murphy recounted his experiences while working guard duty at the Capitol Theater. When Dave Murphy came in for his first training shift as a protective services officer in the historic Capitol Theater, his training officer, Morgan Matthews, seemed reluctant to tell him anything more than just his duties. Murphy sensed Matthews was holding something back. But what? Murphy was making a sweep through the theater, checking out the back rooms, when a door to the men's room down the hall slammed shut. He radioed Matthews to check the cameras. Matthews found nothing, but came up to assist. As the door had a hydraulic hinge, it was a very difficult door to slam. Weapons drawn, they went in to investigate. Murphy couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. He got goosebumps walking into that room. The only description he could find was a feeling of evil. They investigated the area, only to discover the room completely empty. They continued to investigate to rule out someone hiding in the building. When they reached the second floor, Murphy was shocked to discover lights he had earlier turned off were back on, and doors he had locked were standing open. Murphy's suspicions had been absolutely correct. Matthews knew more than he let on and was holding back. Matthews explained to Murphy that on a previous night, he had been sitting at the desk monitoring the theater's cameras when he heard voices behind him. These weren't normal speaking voices. These were whispers, the kind heard when people are trying to hide something. When Matthews turned around, there was nobody there. Matthews headed into the theater to investigate. When he reached the basement, there was an odd smell of smoke, as though the building were on fire. Yet, there was no sign of fire anywhere in the building. Matthews told Murphy that this was just one of several incidents that had occurred while he was working overnight shifts at the theater. Blair Fuller, an accountant for the theater, shared some of his own encounters. Mr. Fuller told Murphy that he had had some interesting experiences of his own and told Murphy about one night when he'd been working late. The elevator motor had suddenly engaged, a loud sound that got Mr. Fuller's attention. He was sure he was alone in the building, so who was using the elevator? When the car arrived at his floor, Mr. Fuller watched as the door opened. Nobody got off. The elevator door stood open long enough to trigger the system's alarm. Still, nobody got off of the elevator. When Mr. Fuller walked over to investigate, nothing was blocking the door. He stepped into the elevator, finding still more nothing. Just as he was about to step out of the elevator car, though, the basement button lit and the door closed. Upon reaching the basement, Mr. Fuller stepped into the corridor. Not a soul was in sight. When he returned to his desk on the third floor, Mr. Fuller was once again pulled away. This time, it was by the file cabinet drawers opening and clanging shut on their own. One night near the end of Murphy's training period, Murphy's friend, Greg Giddens, came by to pay a visit. Greg was known to possess an ability to see things that most others couldn't. Murphy believed his friend's psychic insight might help them figure out what was going on. Greg came into the theater cold. Neither officer had told him why he was there. They had just offered him a tour of the place. Greg looked around the auditorium and saw many people standing about. Greg commented that they hadn't told him the place was haunted. As they were walking through the basement, they spotted an open door. The trio walked closer, and the door slammed shut. Drawing their weapons, the officers approached the door. The handle began to violently rattle. They pushed open the door to discover an empty room. The three proceeded down the hall, disturbed to find it getting warmer. Greg approached the area where Matthews had smelled the smoke. Greg smelled it as well and asked if there had been a fire. Greg turned and saw a young man in the corner of that room. Neither of the officers saw him. Once Greg left, things began to get crazier. One night, Matthews was using a new infrared monitor when it picked up a figure sitting in the audience as though they were watching a show. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure shot across the screen, snarling as it moved. As Murphy was guarding the theater alone, he began to hear ragtime music. He followed the sound into the lower levels of the theater, where he found the piano with its lid locked down. It wasn't a player piano. Murphy walked out, vowing never to work alone in the theater again. Officer Josh Thomas replaced Murphy at the theater. On his first night, while he's on the phone to Murphy, Thomas reported that the elevator was suddenly moving on its own. Murphy raced over to assist, and the duo searched the building, weapons drawn. Thomas heard whispers in his ear while Murphy stood across the stage. Thomas later said he saw a black head staring right at him from behind Murphy. This was the last straw. From that night on, both Murphy and Thomas resigned from guard duty at the Capitol Theater. Ghostly sightings and encounters still occur regularly at the theater. Despite all the reported paranormal activity, performances have continued at the Capitol Theater. Like they say in show business, the show must go on. This concludes today's episode of the Paranormal Report. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a thumbs up and consider subscribing to our channel. It is due to your continued viewership and support that we are able to bring you interesting and informative videos like this. The team here at the Paranormal Report really appreciates your support.